Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our viewers from around the world. Thanks so much for tuning into the largest ever virtual gathering on happiness with the Happiness Festival. I think this is coming to you in July 2020. I am Dr. Nettra Pan. I'm a lecturer in social change and entrepreneurship at Cass Business School in London. My research and teaching focuses on how for-profit firms resolve tensions between commercial and seemingly non-commercial objectives, such as poverty reduction, carbon footprint reduction, and workplace well-being, just to name a few examples. And that's why I'm so happy to be with all of you today for this extremely important panel titled Against All Odds: How Our Understanding of Cognition Changes Our Understanding of Meaningful and Enjoyable Work. During this panel, we'll visit the topics of sources of stress in the workplace, emotionally intelligent responses to stress, how entrepreneurship affects well-being, mental disorders associated with entrepreneurship, qualities job seekers, employees, managers could seek in their work. And to help us unpack all these topics, I'm really pleased to say I'm joined by an all-star panel. First, we have Professor Johan Wiklund. Hi, Johan.
Hi, Nettra.
Professor Johan Wiklund is the Alberg Chair and Professor of Entrepreneurship at the Whitman School of Management at Syracuse University, and he holds other positions in Lund University in Sweden, as well as in Australia. His research interests include entrepreneurship and mental health, as well as the entry, performance, and exit of entrepreneurial firms. He's a leading expert in entrepreneurship with over 17,000 citations. He's the incoming editor-in-chief for Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, and he has also edited special issues on well-being and entrepreneurship. I'm also joined by Dr. Erik Nook. Hi, Erik.
Hello.
Erik is tuning in from Massachusetts, from Boston, if I'm not correct.
I'm actually in New York City right now.
Oh, you're in New York City. Okay, so you're a little bit closer to where I'm hosting this Zoom call. So Erik Nook completed his undergraduate degree in psychology at Columbia University, where he worked with Professor Kevin Oshner. After 2 years as a lab manager for Professor Zamil Zaki at Stanford University, he began a clinical psychology PhD at Harvard University, where he worked with Professor Leah Somerville. Erik is currently completing his pre-doctoral internship at Weill Cornell Medical College in New York City. Okay, that explains why in New York City. And he focuses on how language and emotion interact. He uses behavioral and neuroscientific tools to study how labeling our emotions influences how we regulate and represent them. He also uses developmental and translational lenses to study how children and teenagers learn about emotions and how they develop an emotion lexicon related to mental health. So Erik, you'll tell us a little bit more about that. And then last but not least, I'm really pleased to introduce Katherine McMahon. She's a graduate student in the clinical psychology doctoral program at Duke University, and she's currently completing her clinical internship also at Weill Cornell New York Presbyterian Hospital. She's under the mentorship of Dr. Zachary Rosenthal and training in the science and practice of treating interpersonal issues within transdiagnostic clinical populations. So you'll explain a little bit more what you mean about that. And her research focuses on how emotion regulation skills like mindfulness influence empathy, the ability to perceive and understand other people's emotions. Kivi is also experienced in treating anxiety, depression, and personality disorders with contemporary cognitive behavioral therapies. And she's also a Vinyasa yoga instructor. So she's drawing upon this practice as well, complementing her more traditional psychology experimental work to better understand this topic. So that's enough talking from me for now. I would love to kick us off and actually try to understand. So well-being, stress, entrepreneurship, I mentioned a lot of words. So maybe we can just take a step back and try and understand how can we actually think about well-being in the workplace? What are the moving parts? Why is this important? So maybe we can start with Dr. Erik Nook. Erik?
Sure. So I'm happy to give a little bit of background on how psychologists think about stress itself. So a very popular theory comes from Lazarus and Folkman, the appraisal theory of stress. And it's a very simple idea that people feel stress when they think of a situation as asking more of their resources than what they actually have on hand. And that perspective on their current situation causes a stress response, which has psychological components, biological components, motivational components, emotional components. And this perspective can be very helpful in many different situations. That's why we have it, because it gears you up to expend resources in order to meet the challenge that's you're facing in the situation. But also, if the appraisal is that hey, there's no way I can actually cope with the situation that I'm facing, then you actually experience distress, and that distress can come with all sorts of maladaptive reactions, feeling defeated by the situation, or just overwhelmed, and kind of at your wit's end. And so if you think more concretely about what these different situations can be, there's they fall out really nicely from that definition. So if there's a lot of time pressure and you feel that no matter that what's being asked of you in the situation, you just do not have the temporal resources to really accomplish what the situation demands, you're going to feel probably very distressed. And then if things are really uncontrollable, unexpected, or aversive, that is also going to induce a stress response. So if if there are challenges that come up or a job description that is not quite what you were expecting it to be, or if other people are behaving in ways that are really challenging, these are things that are going to add to a lot of stress in a work environment. So those are, that's how psychologists tend to think about stress, and some of the different sources that come to mind.
That's really interesting, Eric, what you mentioned about having a baseline of resources, and then stress being basically our response to how we view the resources that we have on hand versus what the situation calls for. And so I'm recalling some studies that I've seen that shows, as you said, that stress can be a good thing in manageable amounts. So it's essentially a curvy linear relationship where too little and you're not motivated at all, too much you're in distress, as you said. So it's all about managing your resources or developing your resources to find that middle ground that I guess some psychologists also call flow.
Mhm.
When basically the amount of challenge is just right for you.
Mhm.
I would love to hear your thoughts, Kibi, on generally how should we think about stress in the workplace.
Yeah, Eric, that was fantastic. That was so it was great. Yeah, so I was just thinking from the clinical side, in these contemporary cognitive behavioral therapies, what we say is people suffer when they don't live in line with their values, whatever those are. So we have a diversity of values. Like your values different than mine, and why I work might be different than yours. But if we don't, if our work doesn't line up with the things that we find valuable and meaningful in life, it could lead to a lot of burnout. It could lead to a lot of stress and anxiety and a lot of questioning of why am I doing this, right? Like the daily grind that doesn't feel meaningful can be super stressful, um, defeating in many ways. So not clarifying the value of your values and not engaging in work activities that really are in line with that can be super stressful and lead to a lot of burnout. And we can talk about burnout later, but so that's one thing that comes to mind. The second thing that comes to mind is my work says, I'm so focused on how relationships and social connection is so important to well-being overall. We could definitely see that during the pandemic, right? People feel that very strongly. And so when people don't have a healthy work environment where they feel supported, they don't have people around them that empathize with them and share their experience or listen to their needs, like as part of the resources that Eric was talking about, that could lead to a lot of stress, right? When people feel alone, when people feel like they don't have support emotionally or instrumentally to do what they need to do, that could feel also very stressful and lead to a lot of burnout, anxiety, and depression. So those are the two things that pop into mind: work not being meaningful and not feeling meaningful, and not feeling supported or having a good social network at work.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much for pitching in, Kibbe. Johan, what are your comments?
Yeah, I have a question, Eric. So it's really interesting. I heard you mentioning appraisal theory there. So we actually conducted a study where we looked at entrepreneurs going through what is probably the most stressful thing you can imagine as an entrepreneur, which is failure. So we essentially studied entrepreneur who had gone through bankruptcy. We called them soon after the bankruptcy and spoke to them, and also had them do some survey work. And one thing we noticed was just the enormous difference in terms of how they reacted emotionally to this event. And I mean, some grieved to an extent as if they had lost a loved one. I think they have the emotional connection. I think you can make that a connection for entrepreneurs. You know, some are so much devoted to their business; it's like being devoted to a partner. Whereas others kind of just, felt like, well, shit happens. It's not a big deal, and I think sometimes in entrepreneurship, it's like I think you all heard about this failing forward, and venture capitalists speak about how entrepreneurs might need one or two failures before they want to invest in them. And I think that's something that might apply to some entrepreneurs, but it's also clear that a lot of entrepreneurs just suffer, to use the term you used there, Kibbe, suffer immensely when their businesses fail. So I just want to know if you have any reflections about that, Eric.
That's really interesting to think about, and I think it fits nicely with an appraisal approach to think about stress, but also about emotion. And appraisal theorists think that the way you're going to feel about a situation, it really doesn't lie in the situation itself.
Yeah.
It lies in your understanding, interpretation, and the meaning you make out of the situation, which is also a contribution that Aaron Beck made to cognitive behavior therapy, in thinking that the way we think about something is really key. And I love this idea of losing. Well, I mean, it's very sad when a failure happens and someone feels very upset about it, but it is very interesting to think about it as akin to a death. In this appraisal, that you've really lost something. Mm-hmm. And also, if you build something from the bottom up, you give it a name, it makes sense that your mind might start to mentalize that entity as something that actually is living and breathing and growing. And for it to end would be really hard, in the same way as losing a person. You've invested so much in it. You've imagined a future for it, so you can see why these appraisals, like some of the interpretations you're saying, would make sense. So I think even though they're valid, though, it's really cool to hear that you're doing research on what's actually helpful for people in the long run. And so maybe the appraisals we want to help people make when things don't work out is, what am I learning from this? What goes on in the future? As Kibbe brought up, what's in line with my values? Yeah. As long as I'm working for my values, the outcomes are less important to me. It's really about doing things in the world that are leading me in a direction that I feel is helpful in my life, but also helpful in the world more generally. Kibbe,
yeah, it just strikes very personally to me because I'm also a business owner. I have opened up a fitness studio right before the pandemic, and so I definitely feel the fear of failure and all of that anxiety that comes with that. And I think that, to add on to what Eric was saying, it's I think when, especially in entrepreneurship, especially in the US, I would say, or maybe not just in the US, but anywhere, this becomes your child, this becomes your stamp on the world. And I think when people appraise a business as a part of their identity, part of their legacy, something about, the meaning of what that business is, the idea of losing it can be even more terrifying, versus if it's like, hey, this is just one of many things that I'm contributing to this world, or this is just a job, right? Those kind of appraisals would lead to probably a less fear of failure or depression when that business doesn't go well.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for your comments on that. I would love to, because I know I would like to talk about emotionally intelligent responses to stress. So I think this is a great segue into it, because we started off this conversation talking about, fairly finite or objective or physical ideas that lead to stress, such as time, or maybe money, or maybe physical resources that don't match an amount that is called for, or that we think is called for. But as you've all been discussing so far, there is a very important socially constructed element too, of what we think others expect, as well as what we expect of ourselves. And so we're going now talking about the idea of self-conception. So some of my work looks at social identity, for example, and how the way we view ourselves. So we rely a lot on Brewer and Gardner's work. The way we view ourselves in the world actually defines how we choose to act, and how we measure our actions. So I would love to get your ideas on how can we be then emotionally intelligent when we think about stress, or what we're placing value on. Is there a way to basically understand why you're feeling so upset about something, and is there something we can do in terms of self-understanding, or maybe shifting how we view ourselves in relation to the situation, maybe to the failed startup or other? I would love to open up to the panelists and get your views on that.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to, also just being mindful and being aware of what you're feeling is such an important tool. And this is the first thing that we teach people is, especially if there's stress and anxiety that kind of takes over everything, we teach people to use mindfulness skills to really notice those signs of stress early on before it gets that big, right? It's, taking a couple minutes to check in with yourself, saying, how am I feeling right now? What does it feel like in my body? Oh, I notice that when I'm stressed, I tend to pace around. I'm doing that now. Something must be off. So just noticing throughout the day, how are you feeling could really help you tap into what's going on, because emotions are important signals of things. They're important signals of what's going on in your environment. Are you under threat? Are you losing something? Are you angry? Are you being attacked? So they're really important sources of knowledge, and we can't just ignore them until it gets really bad. They're like important, like alarm signals. So being mindful and aware of what you're feeling. I always think about like what's going on in my body, what's going on in my mind. Those are all important signs of emotion.
So could I tag along there a little bit, because I think it's so important what you're saying, because I just started, I think I'm the first one in entrepreneurship to look at more broad at self-care among entrepreneurs. Exactly the things you're talking about, mindfulness, for example, but also exercise and eating habits and things. And something by which we found is that entrepreneurs that run a business that's up and running, they tend to engage more than employees in these things. And this is comparable employee groups. And we think it's because you have greater control over your time, essentially. So it's easier to run away to the gym, let's say, during a lunch break than it is for a lot of employees. But at the same time, we found that those that were in the process of starting a business, that, they were so busy that they actually did a lot less. And the interesting thing is we immediately saw that this has implications for their state of well-being. So that the entrepreneurs who are taking more time, devoting more time to the things you're talking about, Kibby, they were actually the ones that were feeling better, whereas those entrepreneurs who were in the middle of starting the businesses, they registered lower well-being. So it's very well aligned with what you're saying.
Super interesting. Exactly. When people are starting up a business, you're so focused. The whole business is so focused on starting up the business, right? It's so all consuming. But I think what you're saying is so important that, especially companies that make it part of their culture to promote self-care and check in. Employees that say, hey, how are you doing? I notice you sound a little bit stressed. Like, do you need to take a break? Do you need to like breathe? And do you want me to, so having a workplace culture that really promotes the self-care and checking in with their emotions would do wonders. So I agree with you.
Do you have examples? Do you know who's the best in class in terms of those kinds of businesses that really focus and emphasize on these things? Do you know anything offhand?
I don't. I know that my own business tends to do that. We tend to really support each other. And when someone says I am feeling a little burnt out, say, okay, let's talk about this and promote open communication and support and mutual support on that. But I do know that a lot of business. One that actually comes to mind is Lululemon.
Okay.
Which I was really surprised about, but Lululemon actually has a really good workplace culture where they constantly support that. They even give small funds to the employees to do self-care activities. So, they have a daily budget to go to the gym, to do mindfulness classes, and they check in with each other. They have meetings where they start with mindfulness. So I think Lululemon is doing a really good job with that.
I also know that some of these, business incubators and those kinds of organizations are starting to do this. For example, organizing yoga classes and having mindfulness sessions and so forth. And it's fun. I met a guy who runs. He doesn't run an accelerator. He runs a decelerator. And the reason is that he had gone through a burnout himself, so he knows how stressful it can be, and he kind of wishes people to slow down and be more inward looking, and because there's so much focus, on working around the clock, as you said, and just, stretching yourself, that he started this decelerator. I forgot his name now, but I think it's a pretty cool idea.
I have a few thoughts on this. One thought that I have is all of these great self-care activities that you all are talking about are really just a set of skills that anyone can learn, and that institutions can educate people on, and also that leaders can set as norms within companies, which is what you're discussing.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done some research on how social norms propagate through communities, and we've actually found that in our case, we're showing how preferences for different foods, but it really could be any different type of stimulus. If individuals find out that their peers all really like a certain food, not only do they endorse liking that food more, but also their ventromedial prefrontal cortex is more active in response to those foods. And this region is implicated as really being involved in value-based decision-making.
Wow.
So we have this internal signature of valuation is actually increased by social norms. So you can do a lot of power as a leader by doing the kinds of things that you're talking about, not only psychologically, but also neuroscientifically, which is really interesting. And then I had another thought on this idea of decelerating. It reminds me of Bina Venkataraman's book, The Optimist's Telescope. Her kind of contribution in the book is a real critique of one aspect of modern culture, which is so focused on today, the next quarter, what are we doing right now? Are we doing everything for right now? Are we doing everything for right now? And that is really out of line with how historically a lot of human society has moved and thought, and also out of line with values and even outputs, like human lives getting burned out. And is this really the culture we want to produce? And I know that there are reasons why people think this way. I'm not saying it's silly to have this ingrained in you, but she really talks about, hey, let's take a look at what we want to leave on this earth years or generations from now. And we take that perspective a completely different way of operating. So it's cool to hear about a decelerator.
Thank you, everyone, for all your thoughts here. I think we're now entering, from a more theoretical standpoint of, what is stress in the workplace, to actually some really important outcomes that can be devastating. So I want to throw in a few current event examples too. In Japan, it's so common for employees to work themselves to death that there's a word for it called karoshi, and there's a social norm that is very much in line with duty and an obligation that makes it somehow socially acceptable, although it's becoming less so, to actually dedicate your life, even literally, to this. And we've seen the same thing. It's not only a Japanese phenomenon. We've seen it also in the financial industry, where interns under high pressure also suffer heart failure, sometimes fatally. And this led Goldman Sachs in 2015 to restrict the intern workday to 17 hours. So this essentially means go home before midnight and don't come back before 7 a.m. So if you can think about, what was actually happening, people would go home, take a shower, leave the car running if they ordered an Uber or a taxi, and then get back into their car. So we have definitely skills that we can do, thankfully. Thank you, Erik, for bringing that up. But it's also the role of founders and of policymakers and of institution leaders to actually set norms and make clear boundaries on that point. So other things, we could do is be explicit about the norms of your organization, about what you're here for, why you're here, and what actually matters. Is it really the bottom line at the end of the day, or something else? You can also use firm-related tools. Maybe you have less variable rewards and more non-variable rewards to reduce that source of stress there. So there's a conceptual work that can be done by leaders, as well as some strategies, some basic strategies regarding remuneration before you even get to the coconut water and the yoga and the massage classes that we see very often in Silicon Valley. So speaking of this toxic work culture that exists, I want to turn over to the panelists and ask based on your research or your clinical work, what are some mental disorders or common common types of distress that you've seen? And maybe I can start with Johan, since you're an expert here in entrepreneurship.
You mean in entrepreneurship?
Right.
Yeah. So, I think that, let me roll back a little and say, I think that, the narrative we've seen in entrepreneurship, and if you just look at in popular press, but also in research, has been very much an economic one. So it's been very much focused on, making a profit, and who makes a greater profit. It's about getting venture capital funding, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that that's fine in a way, but it's become too dominating. I think it's important to also ask the questions of, who actually enters into entrepreneurship, and why do people become attracted to entrepreneurship? And if we ask those questions seriously, I think we get to observe other things. And one of the things is what you're bringing up now in terms of mental disorders, because we have noticed that if we ask a question, who is attracted to entrepreneurship, we find that essentially people that are along any dimension different from the norm tend to be attracted to entrepreneurship. And we can take the example of like recent immigrants. We can take the example of people with a disability. And it seems that, people with certain mental differences are also attracted to entrepreneurship. And the ones that are best known are probably people with dyslexia and people with ADHD. Those are two specific conditions. And it also seems that people with these two conditions can potentially do very well in entrepreneurship. And the reason why, is largely that, first of all, if you are different and you go to a job interview, it's not very likely you're going to get a job, because it's something which people notice, and most organizations just want to hire somebody who's just like everybody else. But the beauty of entrepreneurship is a little bit like the beauty of being an academic. You can shape your work to be whatever you want it to be. And then if you are different, it's you can actually overcome your weaknesses and shortcomings and leverage your strengths. I can just give an example. I've interviewed a person who's blind and runs a cafe, and he's immediately said, if I went and applied for a job at a cafe and I can't see, I'm never going to get a job. But I can run my own cafe because I've hired people who can do the things I can't, and I'm very good myself at certain things. So that's a good example. And that also applies to people that are mentally different. And like I said, if you have dyslexia or ADHD, it seems that you have certain strengths which you can leverage in entrepreneurship.
Yeah, so Kibi, did you like that? But I just wanted to say, Kibi, did you like that shout out that you're an outlier there as a business owner?
That's true. I think the ADHD, why people with ADHD would be attracted to entrepreneurship makes total sense, especially the amount of stimulation and the amount of lots of moving parts and the excitement that comes with entrepreneurship. It's up and down. You're constantly looking for different things. So definitely I can understand that. I do see that there would be a flip side to that, where people with ADHD tend to feel very anxious a lot of the time, because entrepreneurship is exciting, but also takes a lot of long dedication, organization, completing things. And so people with ADHD could be really good at starting businesses and stuff, but to follow through and make sure that it's well run, that could cause a lot of anxiety because that's not their skill set. So yeah, so I could see that they could hire someone with the organization skills to do that.
Exactly. I mean, the one I think I've spoken to probably 100 entrepreneurs who identify whether they have a formal ADHD diagnosis, and I don't think I've met a single one who does their own books. It's typically the bookkeeping, the attention to detail, as you're talking about. That's where one of their big weaknesses, and it creates a lot of anxiety and stress. So, I mean, there are some people who just don't file their books. I mean, and then of course IRS comes running after them sooner or later. But the most common is, I mean, if you're a new startup and you can't afford hiring somebody, it's typically the spouse or the romantic partner who does the books, because it's nothing that people with ADHD enjoy doing. We also find that it's actually, like you say, the moving parts and those, but also this, the hyperactivity part, that you just have an enormous work capacity. A lot of people emphasize it, that it's very helpful as well, that they can, like Nettra, you mentioned the people there at, I think you said Goldman Sachs, putting in 17 hours per day. I mean, there's a lot of entrepreneurs with ADHD who are happy to put in those hours, and they feel that they can work more hours and more effectively than other people. And also the impulsivity, that they're not afraid. They're not afraid of trying new things. They're not afraid of acting. So it's a little bit like being a firefighter. I often say that if my house starts burning and the firefighter comes, I will be very happy if that person has ADHD, because I know they will act they'll be very resolute, and they will be very quick in acting. And that's also something which can be valuable in entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I think this is an excellent discussion, and to loop it back actually to the definition of stress that Erik mentioned again at the beginning of the panel, because I think it's such a helpful metaphor. If we think about a set of resources, again, not being enough or meeting a certain threshold for a certain situation, all of a sudden with this discussion about mental disorders and individual differences more broadly, we actually see there is a interpretation involved in understanding our resources versus seeing it as a disadvantage. So we see, as you mentioned, Johan, about people with disabilities kind of being pulled into the opportunities of entrepreneurship. Sometimes it's a necessity entrepreneurship. It's not an exciting source of growing income, but it's just a job. But other times, the entrepreneur is actually forced into this role because they don't fit the typical characteristic that others are looking for, which may actually turn out to be a good thing for them. So this is a really interesting question, I think, to unpack, especially at this time as we try to think about work-life balance, since a lot of people are working from home with the pandemic, and what that means for parents of young children, or single parents or single mothers, as well as what it means for perhaps people of color who face other types of systemic discrimination when applying for jobs. And what does that mean for them? Can they then actually create their own opportunity? Maybe that is their main choice that is available to them. So this is actually really interesting in terms of how do we interpret our own resources that we have vis-a-vis the situation. Well, we are running a little bit out of time, so I would love to turn to each panelist. If there's something that I should have asked you that I didn't, please do feel free to share. You have a wealth of experience and wisdom here that I would be remiss to overlook. So please do share that, and maybe if you have any closing remarks then about what viewers should do if they themselves are looking for a job or are in a current job that's providing stress, or if someone is actually in a position of power, maybe they're their manager or founder, kind of what would you recommend to them in terms of thinking about well-being and the entire human as we are also active members of this economic system?
I can jump in, like closing remarks. So what a great set of prompts. So I have
I'm all over. Choose whichever one you like.
You're welcome. So in thinking about mental health, we talked a lot about how certain kinds of psychological processes that people might consider not normal or a disorder, like ADHD can actually be helpful. But I also want to talk about the other side. So, anxiety and feelings of sadness or burnout are, as Kitty said, normal responses to things that are going on in the environment, but they can become too much and can become impairing. And this is really normal. And we just got to talk about it because clinical scientists estimate that 50% of people will have a diagnosable mental illness at some point in their life, 1 in 2. And so if you are having this experiences, you have not failed. There's nothing wrong with you. This is a part of being a human being. And there's a whole profession of people who have dedicated their lives to helping people learn how to feel better, sleep better, remember more, have better relationships. And so just find a therapist and chat with them. And if you notice that other people in your community are impaired by their level of anxiety or depression or other experiences that they're having, create a culture of encouraging them to reach out and go to help, just as you would if somebody hurt their arm, like encourage them to seek care. So I also wanted to talk about that aspect of mental health in the workplace. My other thoughts were thinking about launching from the point of what you do if you notice your well-being is low, your stress is high. 2 ideas from my research are, one, the importance of taking a distanced perspective on a situation. So I've done some research showing that looking at a negative situation by kind of seeing it from a more distant perspective, or even just changing your language, as simply as not using the word I, but using your own name when writing about something that's upsetting you, can reduce your negative distress. And research by Ethan Cross suggests that also increases your ability to perform in high stress situations. So see things from how is this going to play out a long time from now? Or if something really upset you, make sure you see it as in the past. It's not happening right now. So distancing is one idea. And then the final idea I'll leave you with is this concept of emotion differentiation or emotion granularity. So we know that people vary in how specifically they can really identify what they're feeling. Some people just feel bad a lot, and some people feel frustration, but then annoyed, and then they're very specific and granular in their emotions. And these individuals cope, are more resilient to stressful experiences, and have higher mental health indices overall. So learning how to be very specific, these skills that could be shared with us, noticing when you're feeling something, trying to figure out what that feeling is in particular and the best way to handle it, are skills that we can learn. And mindfulness has actually been shown to be very helpful with it. So those are some of my concluding remarks.
Thank you so much, Eric. I do want to just highlight that 50% are expected to be diagnosed with some sort of mental disorder, which actually gets to the title of the panel, Against All Odds, and how our understanding of cognition can change our understanding of meaningful and enjoyable work. So thank you for sharing that and for pushing towards a destigmatization of these diagnoses. Because if your arm was broken, I mean, you just go and get it looked at, right? So this is a big shout out if anyone who's watching, if you feel pulled to to see a therapist. There are a lot of organizations out there that that sponsor therapy for people with a lower social economic income. I mean, so we can link up to a few resources there, but do reach out to your community, even if it seems like something that is completely out there. So thank you so much for sharing that, and for also sharing the skill of maybe how to just simple tricks that you can do to remove yourself conceptually from this stressful situation. So using the third person, talking about yourself in the third person and witnessing kind of what you're going through to kind of strengthen that emotional intelligence and actually be able to discern what is actually happening, and that it's not the 3 Ps. It's not personal, it's not permanent, and it's not pervasive. So to actually take a step back from that. I would love to hear, KB, Johan, what are your concluding remarks? What would you like to leave our viewers with?
Sure. I think the one mental disorder, I don't think it's necessarily a mental disorder, but a condition that people suffer from at the workplace often is burnout. So burnout is a growing problem in the workplace, entrepreneurship, and healthcare, and all these different spheres. In parenting as well, people who are parents, that's a workplace too. So burnout, for people who don't know a lot about it, burnout is a feeling of depression. So feeling like you don't care anymore, you're sad, you don't even, you're not excited about what you're doing. So this kind of feeling of depression, plus this feeling that you're not effective. So it also affects the way you feel about yourself and your ability to get things done. So if you feel depressed, plus this doubt that you can really keep going, or doubt in yourself, or changes in the way you see your skill set and strengths, that's a lot of signs of burnout. That's like on the end of like when you're so stressed for so long and don't have the resources and support, people tend to suffer from burnout. So just to be aware of that. And I'll add to Erik's list of tips and skills. For one thing, when I was talking about making sure that you are living in line with your values, taking a moment to reflect on what your values are, or remind yourself. Little tricks that I ask my patients is, let's say it's your 80th birthday and everyone's celebrating and giving speeches, celebrating your life. What do you want them to say? What are the kind of things that they would celebrate about your long and fruitful life? So that's a little like thought experiment to do, or even just think about what is a meaningful moment? What is in the past like 24 hours or week that you felt like, oh, that's what life is all about. That was really worth it, even if it was so hard. So focusing on why that was so meaningful to you. So taking a moment to reflect on your values is really important. And different tricks to skills to do during the day to check in with yourself and how you're feeling emotionally and your sources of stress. I just promote saying, take 1 minute, like time it on your phone, 1 minute every few hours to take a deep breath, notice how you're feeling in your body, notice what's going on in your mind, and you can ask yourself certain questions. You could say, how am I doing right now? How stressed am I on a scale of 0 to 10? And so even if you do that once a day, a couple times a day, taking 1 minute out of your day to check in with yourself would be super helpful to prevent that burnout and the buildup of stress in the future.
Thanks so much, KB, for kind of demystifying, what we mean by mindfulness. You talked earlier in the panel about, checking in physically. How does the body feel? And what mindfulness means, because sometimes we associate it with, okay, it's like some sort of hippie thing. What on earth does it mean? So these are actually really concrete steps. Just how do I feel from 1 to 10 in terms of stress? And I think that's really meaningful. I also love what you raise in terms of values and trying to understand your values, because if we think about our lives or the work that we engage in, there's always going to be more enjoyable and less enjoyable parts. So it's really important to understand, why am I doing the least and the less enjoyable part, and create that meaning for ourselves by understanding our own values. So thanks so much for adding that. Johan, what are your reactions?
Yeah, so first I want to comment on what Erik said about referring to yourself as a third person. I always thought that was a sign of inflated ego. I just learned that it could be a sign of that you care about your own well-being. So that's a good thing to know. Yeah, so I think it's important to think about the fact that, I mean, well-being isn't just the absence of ill-being, that well-being is related to happiness and feeling relationships with other people and so forth. And I think that's where you started this session. I think it's important to also keep that in mind as we wrap it up. And I think that if we look at entrepreneurship, which is my area of research, we can see that a lot of people they enter into entrepreneurship in order to self-actualize, in order to become what they think they're supposed to be. And we can see that when they do research about the overall well-being of entrepreneurs versus people who have or employees, entrepreneurs exhibit on average a little bit higher well-being. And it's largely for this reason, that they feel that they're doing something that's deeply meaningful to them. They were actually able to self-actualize to a greater extent than employees. On the other hand, we see there's a wide distribution. So there's a lot of entrepreneurs who feel good about themselves, but there's also, you know, a lot of entrepreneurs who feel really bad about where they are. And I can just echo what Kim was talking about before in terms of reflecting about over who you are and where you are and investing in self-care activities, because we've seen that those really pay off for entrepreneurs.
Thanks a lot, Johan. Yeah. I think that's a really great set of reactions, and very interesting food for thought as we think about what different career outcomes may represent to us. So I assume you're referring to opportunity-driven entrepreneurship, so maybe more growth-oriented entrepreneurship in terms of self-actualization.
Well,
or
the studies we've seen is just they run these panels across, you know, most countries in the world, and they're just looking at anybody who says I'm working for myself versus those that say I work for somebody else. They don't care about the reasons as to why people start. On average, people who work for themselves score higher on any, you know, you can take subjective well-being, you can take more of the eudaimonic approach to well-being. We see that those that work for themselves score higher than those who work for somebody else. And the explanation is largely this self-actualization aspect, or whatever you want to call it. You do the things that you enjoy, you reap the fruits of your own work and so forth. But I mean, part of the reason we have this wider distribution, I think, is because some are drawn to entrepreneurship, whereas others are more pushed into it. That's, as you can see among, you know, recent immigrants, for example, that because of lack of knowledge of language, maybe due to racism and whatnot, they don't have many other options to start their own businesses. I could imagine they score towards the lower end, but we have the whole spectrum there.
Yeah, that's definitely really interesting food for thought of what could a self-designed job offer us in terms of self-actualization versus what are the barriers preventing others from actually getting that self-actualization, either from the same job or from a different one. So yeah, very, very thought-provoking. I definitely can say that my own understanding of cognition has changed has changed over this panel. A lot of great reminders, great tips of how to think about stress conceptually, how to think about stress perhaps in the moment, and which types of practices we can rely on. To mitigate that, and perhaps also to Johan's point, how we might shift our focus towards a more long-term view of my job in the future, or what I would like to do in the future. Also tying in Kibby's point of, you know, what are my values and what does this mean for the long run? And you know, removing ourselves from maybe that stressful situation of now, and actually thinking about yourself as someone who develops and who evolves and perhaps feels better as well over the long term. So I want to thank everyone for joining in, for viewing. I want to thank our panelists again. Thank you, Johan. Thank you, Erik. Thank you, Kibby. And we'll have our bios and where you can reach us on the website, the Happiness Festival, happiness-festival.org. thanks again, everyone, for tuning in, and be safe wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.